Hello, friends, and welcome to the May 18th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about policy issues here in our great state and have a conversation about how you can engage in that process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and we have a timely episode for you today as we are now in the midst of early voting for the May 24th primary runoff election. Today, we welcome Bishop Mike McKee to the program. Bishop McKee is the bishop of the North Texas Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church, based out of Dallas, a former member of the United Methodist General Board of Church and Society, and now a podcaster in his own right. On this week's watch list, Josh talks with us about what he's watching this election season. And to kick us off, we'll begin with a weekly word from a Texas Impact board member, Father Paul Klitzke, Rector of the Episcopal Church of the Ascension in Dallas. But before we get to the program, I want to share a couple of quick thoughts at the top. First, thanks as always to all who've reached out with comments, questions, and suggestions for the podcast. We love to hear from you. I'll be looking for your emails at scott@texasimpact.org. And help us out by subscribing, sharing, and inviting a friend to listen. Next, a reminder that early voting is now underway, May 16th through 20th for the May 24th primary runoff election. You can vote in the runoff for the primary election you voted in for the March primaries. If you didn't vote in March, you can vote in either primary. There are very important elections on the ballot, and very few people will show up. So let's take this one seriously. And we had several guests leading up to the primaries in March talk about how important the races are and how few people would participate. They talked about how, because of gerrymandering, 95% of the state legislative races would likely be decided in the primaries and how valuable your vote would be in these sparsely attended primary elections. Y'all, the value of your vote is significantly more in the primary runoffs than even the primary elections. And significant decisions about who will represent us will be made. So check your ballots this week and make a plan to vote. I don't know how I can say this more clearly. And then, after you do that, make sure that your friends join you, because odds are most of them are not paying attention. If you need help or have questions, please reach out to us and let us know what we can do to help. It is important, and Texans of faith owe it to our communities to make sure that we're doing our part to participate in democracy. Good? Good. And with that, here we go. The Weekly Word with Father Paul Klitzke.
Greetings from Episcopal Church of the Ascension. I'm Father Paul Klitzke, Rector here at Ascension and a board member of Texas Impact. It's a great privilege to have been invited to participate in the devotion here at the beginning of a weekly witness. As I contemplated what might be shared here, I was struck by a story, a reoccurring story really in the Torah, where Moses, confronted with all of God's people, is trying to help guide them and make decisions, and many cases are brought before him. And as he raises this concern to God, and even sometimes particular concerns, it comes back to him that he needs to select other people to help him with the work. And Exodus 18, verse 17, it says, Moses' father-in-law said to him, "What you're doing isn't good. You will end up totally wearing yourself out, both you and these people who are with you. The work is too difficult for you. You can't do it alone." Later, it goes on to say that Moses chose capable persons from all Israel and set them as leaders over the people, as officers over groups of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. And they acted as judges for these people at all times. They'd refer the hard cases to Moses, but all the minor cases they could decide based on what Moses had decided previously. And I find this fascinating, and it in many ways does resemble the system of government that we have today. We elect people to serve in various ways and capacities to represent us as the legislative body gathers to make decisions that affect all of us. It's sometimes easy to forget that we also have a part in this. We are the representatives to go to those who are elected to represent us. They need to hear our voice so that they can respond to it. They need us to come and tell them how we feel or how the legislative process affects us in our living in order to make the next best decision. One of my favorite stories early in the Bible is a rather odd story from Numbers. It's not as well known, but in Numbers 11, the people are grumbling. They've been in the desert for some time, and the decisions made on their behalf aren't pleasing to them. Maybe this sounds familiar to you as well. And so they grumble. They grumble about the lack of meat in their diet. They gather before Moses and continually grumble about the poor conditions that they're living in and how they'd rather return to Egypt than deal with what they are receiving in the desert. And God hears their grumbling and assures Moses that he will address them directly. These grumbles, the Lord responds in a way that I find kind of humorous, almost like a parent who's disrupted by the ingratitude of their children. In Numbers 11, it reads, "The Lord will give you meat and you will eat. You won't just eat for 1 day or 2 days or 5 days or 10 days or 20 days, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and nauseates you. You've rejected the Lord who's been with you, and you've cried before him saying, 'Why did we leave Egypt?'" Now, I find this humorous in part because it shows even God sometimes maybe gets carried away with the response to grumbling. Although I think it also gives bearing that God does hear when we are struggling and wants to respond. I hope that through our gathering, through the work of Texas Impact, through the weekly witness, that you find that you have a voice, and that whether you feel like you're grumbling or not, that you might use that voice to reach out to those who've been elected, that they might represent us even better. And know that you are not alone as you go. We go together, that our voice might be heard as we stand up and give voice to the needs of our community and to where we see the need to respond with justice for all.
This week's episode was brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas, Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas, and the COVID Collaborative.
Joining us for today's conversation is a weekly witness favorite, Bishop Mike McKee of the North Texas Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. Bishop McKee, welcome back.
Good to be with you, Scott. It's good to be back.
Josh and I talked a couple of weeks ago about UT women's basketball, and I feel like just given your social media presence, I should probably ask you about UT football, but also your Mavericks are having a pretty good run too, right? You must be feeling pretty good up there in North Texas.
So I'm feeling really good. I'm a fan of the Mavericks. This year's been very exciting. I love the way they really came back and won the series that people didn't think they were going to win anyway. So everybody in Dallas is very happy about the Mavericks.
There's something you can all be happy about then. That's good. I'm a Spurs fan, so we have the draft to look forward to. So maybe in a couple of years we'll be back there. But Bishop, before we jump into the topics that I brought you on, or that we invited you on to talk about, I feel like we have to start with another horrific shooting with a white supremacist targeting people of color, this time in Buffalo. It seems like it's a different community almost every time we talk. So how do you hope that congregations and faith leaders respond to the continued racially motivated violence that we continue to see?
You know, as a piece of that, shortly before that shooting, there was a hate crime that happened in Koreatown. That's what they call it in Dallas, in a woman stylist salon, and they called that a hate crime as well. So it's as if when we have a hate crime, sometimes it follows another hate crime, and many of them do not get quite the news that others do. It's always the one, and understandably so, the one that has the most deaths and the one that has involves more people. But why I say that is because, Scott, I think the thing is that these hate crimes are escalating year by year by year by year, and
right.
Nothing seems to work. And maybe it's because we're not working at it enough. I thought about this weekend a lot in this way. Why do we always talk about this as a mental health issue?
Right.
But we ought to talk about it and I'm not saying maybe that's a part of it, but frankly, it's just plain evil. And so I'm reminded of our baptismal vows that we resist evil and injustice in whatever forms they present themselves. And it seems to me that our country has a lot of work to do to ensure people's safety, especially people of color, African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, Native Americans. This is not becoming of our country at all. And it's not only is it not good for many people who live here, most people of color probably step out of their door every day with some legitimate fear. But the thing is, it also affects our own country's position in the world. It is not good for us in every way imaginable. It's not good for us.
So what role do you feel like faith leaders or, the quote unquote church has in responding?
We issued a statement. We had our clergy executive session on Monday, just a couple of days ago, and we issued a statement. We were able to put together a statement that a group of our clergy did on Sunday and Sunday night, and we had it ready to go on Monday at the clergy session, and it passed unanimously. I do think one or two people did some social media posting that is of deep concern to me, and how they consider this. That's to be addressed at another time. But one of the things I've said occasionally, and I want people to understand this, so I'm going to have to spell it out, I guess, in some ways, and that is, I think we are up to date on our prayer life on this one. And what I mean by that is that we cannot think that if we pray hard enough that this is going to turn around. Frankly, we're doing too much talking and not enough listening to God. And so we think, if we pray for the victims, their families, that's all we know how to do. Well, there's several things that can be done. One is that frankly, in this country, some of the public narrative from in news media and even in political places is not conducive to help us on this work. And people who know better need to start calling people out. And that's one of the things. Secondly, I don't, sometimes we paint with a broad brush on this stuff, and we all do. But for the life of me, I do not know why somebody needs an automatic weapon. And when there was that 10-year ban for a period of time that we had before that ban expired, it's not that it was a perfect world, but it wasn't as bad as it is now.
Right. Well, we do still have a long way to go to reach perfection, to quote a little John Wesley today, Bishop. And along those lines, you have launched your own podcast with some other United Methodist bishops titled The Unfinished Church. So talk to us some about that. What inspired it, and what are you hoping to do with it?
So actually, this came from the conversations from Bishop Gregory Palmer, Bishop Luttrell Easterling, and myself. And my first engagement in terms of some collective work was really with Bishop Palmer as a conversation partner. And we laughingly talked. We went to Costa Rica for language school, and we talked more about racism than we did to each other in Spanish. So I don't know that helped our Spanish, but we did talk about racism a lot. And so the three of us sort of came together to talk about some joint learnings, some joint teachings, and different things. And we had other people who were involved in our conversations, our assistants to bishops, our communications people. And so one of the things that came about was somebody said, okay, maybe we should consider doing a joint podcast and trying 6 episodes. And each one of us choose a couple of persons and ask the questions, and we have some follow-ups and that kind of thing. It debuts tomorrow on Thursday, May the 19th. And so that's how that came about. And I've had a really, really, I would say, not only an enjoyable, but also a very fulfilling time doing these 6 podcasts with my colleagues. The outtakes of them are pretty funny, just because so that came from that, because we're all, the Council of Bishops is very engaged in racial equity, diversity, and anti-racism work. And so I guess this was our part to play between the 3 annual conferences, and because of the kind of respect we have for each other.
What kind of questions are you going to be taking on?
During that podcast?
Yeah.
Well, we've already recorded all of them, so it's not like I think we will take questions, I think, via the chat and everything. So we've already recorded all of them, and they're in the can, ready to go, starting tomorrow. And prior to June, one of the guests I'm excited about all of them. One of the guests I'm excited about is prior to June 19th, Opal Lee, who's the godmother of the Juneteenth Act, and a citizen of Fort Worth, Texas, my hometown. And her name is a name I heard for a long time in Fort Worth. This is just ongoing work, and the kind of joy she just brought to the recording and to the work we did was exciting. So now I heard of people I'd never known of before, and it'll be fun. Ibu Patel, who's a friend of mine, is also one of them, and he, of course, is doing as interfaith work, and he's changing his nature. And I won't talk in terms of the kind of work he's doing or the where he's going to do it. And I think that's a piece that will come out in that podcast as well.
All right, nice tease. So where can we find that podcast?
The Unfinished Church.
We will all take a look. I can't wait to hear the opening episode tomorrow. We'll all listen to that after we listen to this Weekly Witness episode.
I can tell you who all the guests are, unless you think we ought to tease
go for it.
Okay, so Nadia Bose-Weber, a familiar name. Ibu Patel, Fred Marsh, who is a Native American retired clergy in the Western Ohio Conference, Willie Jennings, an African-American Black theologian, Opal Lee, who I've already referenced, and Brian McLaren. So I think we have some very, very interesting persons that some of whom are well-known, others who are known for a few people, but each one of them brought some very significant, I would say, not only information, but learnings would be the best way to say it to the work. So
we'll definitely look forward to that. Bishop, we are in the middle of early voting for the May 24th election, and we've talked time and time again on this podcast about the importance of voting in primary elections because there's low turnout and 95% of the races are determined in the primary for the legislative races. So my hope is that people will really engage in this election. But we also have a big election coming up in November for the general election. And I wonder, as a faith leader, as somebody who's really pushed civic engagement for the entirety of your career, are there any particular issues that you're paying attention to as we move throughout the series of election seasons?
I think so. Do you know what the overarching issue is for me related to voting? Is this. First of all, making it difficult to vote, I think, is problematic. And assuming that persons are not registered, or they're not even a citizen of this country because their color of skin is really, you are better than that. We are just better than that. The other piece that really has troubled me for some time is the number of people who don't vote. Here we have allegedly the world's greatest democracy and one of the lowest turnouts, even in a presidential election year. Well, that doesn't say a lot. It says either I don't trust the system or I don't think it's important. But whatever it does, whatever we figure out what it does say, it does not make it good for us. And so I think the lack of civic engagement on the part of so many people, and that alarms me. And after this podcast is over, I'm leaving to go home early so I can go early vote, because I do that early in the morning, and I have not done it yet. And so I'm going to do that. And so now
I'll look for your picture on social media later this afternoon.
Yeah, I don't. Taking a selfie is not easy for Mike McKee, I'll tell you that. Would you take a picture of me as I'll say to probably the poll watcher or poll
Right.
worker? Can I relate a story I did on the steps of the Capitol when we were meeting with legislators?
Absolutely.
So when I was a student at the University of Texas, I was privileged to be with a group of about, I think there were 4 to 6 of us. I think there were 4 or 5 of us really that had a private tour of the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library because it had just opened. And so I was still a student at the University of Texas, and I went on a tour with Lady Bird Johnson, the 5 of us and Lady Bird Johnson. Never have I met or been around somebody as gracious as she was. I mean, I have since, but I just think this was just remarkable. And she was so much fun. And finally, we were able to go up and meet President Johnson, whose hands I shook on November 22nd, 1963, in the Hotel Texas parking lot in Fort Worth, along with the then current president, John Kennedy. But anyway, I asked Lyndon Johnson a question. He asked if we had any questions. We'd already introduced ourselves. And he said, "Do you have any questions?" I said, "Mr. President, I want to know what you consider your greatest achievement in your career as president, your time as president of the United States." He could remember each one of our names as he was talking to us after he just met us. I was just like, this is amazing. And he said, "Mike, everybody points to the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, and it was very important." And then he talked about the Fair Housing Bill. And then he pulled this letter up and he read the letter from a woman. And she said, "Mr. President, I want to thank you for Medicare. Had it not been for Medicare, my mother would have died." And so he did this long list of what I consider very important in terms of forming the American public and the health and well-being of Americans, despite the color of your skin or your economic status. And then he said, "But the most important piece of legislation was the Voting Rights Act, because without it, nothing else would have lasted." And so I go back. We mentioned voting. It's how we got into this question. It's so important that people go vote, and that we don't let the people who just engaged or just think this is a power trip about their own particular, peculiar, unique piece they have of what they think our country, our state, our city should look like, but that somehow it's given to more people to express than just a few. And right now, the turnout rates, for instance, in city elections, school board elections are abysmal. Not only should we be embarrassed, we should be ashamed that the allegedly freest country on earth, and we don't take advantage of that right to vote.
Yeah, the right to vote is one, and certainly we talked about legislation about voting rights during the last legislative session. Is there anything else you're watching in terms of state legislative races or issues going on here in the Texas legislature?
No, I mean, I'm not really. I know a thing that deeply concerns me, just because of the state of healthcare in our state, is that we need to get to the point where we will expand Medicaid in this state. It will help all of our hospitals, who then would have would be paid for the services they offer to people who have no insurance related to their own health and well-being. And I've heard this said so many times, and that is that, the economic health, let's say, of a county is heavily influenced by the physical, mental, emotional health of the citizens who live there. And I think, we pride ourselves on being a very economically active and great state. We could be better if we had more access to health care. And Medicaid is the way to do it. So that's always a persistent piece for me. It comes from a long time. Some work I did in Tarrant County related to accessibility to the public health system there.
Absolutely. And back to the voting conversation, and and elections. One of the things that Texas Impact is going to be talking to congregations this summer about, and has been talking about for the last few months, but we'll have a series of events this summer and fall, is because of the recent changes in Texas voting laws. I think there's a lot of concern that there won't be enough election infrastructure in place, that we might have a shortage of election workers because of some of the changes that were made. And so mainline congregations seem well positioned to help recruit people across the political spectrum to help protect that election infrastructure. So we're going to be talking to congregations about recruiting election workers to make sure that everybody has a chance to vote and the lines are short and that they're all the people needed to serve our community through these elections. Does that seem like something congregations can help provide leadership on?
I'm confident it happens in some of our congregations, and we can probably figure out which ones they are. I would think, I think it would be a good idea. And so bringing that question up makes me think maybe I need to sort of do a little helping people think about how important that is. And so if you'll send me an email, I'll remember to say that the annual conference it's coming up. And
all right,
I've also heard that people are very hesitant of going to work polls now because of the legislation that happened, and worried about, unintentionally creating what's now evidently a criminal act. And so that's pretty scary to think we've got things.
It is a problem. Yeah, it is a problem. And I think one of the fears, who's going to hurt if election workers don't show up, right? There are certain communities that aren't going to have enough folks, and there are going to be much longer lines than usual. So I think this is an area.
And I do think, let's be honest, that does depend on the counties you live in some respects. I mean, I think in Dallas County, they'll try to be very helpful and that, but it's hard to get people, I know now, to get people to work the polls. And the other thing is I think that sometimes there's so much frustration or built up distrust that I think some people think, and I said this earlier, why am I bothering to go vote? It doesn't make a difference.
Now I feel like I'm making an argument, but I'm just going to keep rolling. I think that's why it is so important, though, that we have these people who are volunteering to work as election judges and election workers, so that, we have people of conscience who can come out and say, I participated in the process and it worked. And let me tell you how and why and what I saw. And so just I guess I'm advocating now for listeners to consider doing that and try to get your churches involved.
I would affirm that. If you're listening to this, you can do the work. We need you to do it. And and really, we want every citizen to vote.
Yes.
We'll all be healthier because of it. And so I know that many of you will say, hey, I can do that and give up a day or two or 3 or 4.
Yeah. And if you have questions, let us know. We'll certainly be providing more information over the summer months.
Just an aside, whenever I retire, if that ever happens, given the state of the church, I thought, I might work the polls. And my wife Joan said, well, that's the funniest thing I've ever heard. You can't sit still for that length of time to work the polls, Mike. So I'll say, I'm thinking about it. My precinct chair's encouraging me to do that.
Yeah, you should. There's always the nice greeter at the front. You'd be great at that. Well, all right. We're gonna follow back up on that. We have a couple of homework assignments on our end to follow up with you. Bishop, you did mention retirement, and I'm not going to ask you specifically about that, but I do feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about the United Methodist Church, of which you're a bishop and I'm a member. The United Methodist Church has been in the news a lot lately, and I think will continue to be for the next year or two or more, with words like schism or splintering being thrown around. So for listeners who haven't been paying attention, the United Methodist Church was supposed to have a general conference in 2022 where there was talk of some kind of splintering. That was postponed to 2022 and now again to 2024. And a conservative alternative has launched, and some churches might be deciding to leave. So what should listeners know about that process? And are you confident the United Methodist Church will continue for future generations to do the important work that it has done over the last generations?
So the first thing, I don't call it schism or maybe splintering occasionally, but people will leave. And so that's going to happen. But, as an aside to that, I think some people have been preparing to leave for a long, long time. And I'm not talking about 3 years.
Right.
I think, yes, there's going to be a United Methodist Church, but it's not going to be the United Methodist Church as we know it today. But neither is it going to be the United Methodist Church that the Wesleyan Covenant Association and the new denomination Global Methodist Church, it's not going to be the church they say it's going to be. I mean, that's been somewhat of a fear tactic on their part, in my opinion, and that's what I'm giving as my opinion today on everything we've asked about. And so I think it's been somewhat disingenuous to assume that that's what the church is going to look like. I will say this: we'll still be a church that believes in the authority of the Bible. We'll still be a church that believes in a triune God. We'll still be a church that believes that Jesus is divine. We'll still be a church that knows that we've all been formed the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. We still will be a church that has the best understanding of the grace, its implications, and its various forms of any other Christian church in the world. We will still be all of that and above, and we'll still be a church that sometimes gets into messy things about calling out moral and ethical behaviors on the part of communities that really does not help someone become the best that God intends them to be. We will still be that church. We'll not be a bunch of heretics. We will not be people who are just, beating the next drum on anything. We will be fully engaged with both personal and social holiness as we've always been. So that's where I am. I actually think people want a purpose in life, and that's emerging in some recent data and polls. And I think we're probably positioned better on that than most other churches. And this is not a competition or anything. This is just an understanding of Christianity that Methodists have had forever. And it somewhat grieves me that people that want to leave. And I will say this: as we talk to different congregations, it's like, who told you that? And so it's about the misinformation, that kind of thing. So we are the world's worst at our own propaganda machine. And I don't mean to use that really in that way, but we're not good at the marketing and helping people understand who we are. And I do think we made a couple other mistakes, of which I have to admit that I've been a party to, but so most United Methodist clergy, is when people join from other traditions, we've not formed them in our own tradition. We were just glad to have them come in, but the formation in our particular tradition is important. I hope we recover that.
All right. Well, we will look forward to more conversations on that. Bishop, I am so grateful for your leadership and for taking the time to be with us today. Blessings on your continued ministry, and I'll look forward to seeing you at annual conference in a couple of weeks. Are you coming? I am going to come up. I have a couple friends being ordained and commissioned, and so at least coming up for that, I'll probably hang out a little more too, just because your annual conference is so much fun.
Thank you for saying that.
Am I the one person to say that the annual conference is fun?
Well, I've had several bishops who come in, and one says, "Look, if you have an invitation to go to North Texas, you need to go." And I think the worship is rich. I think it's a good atmosphere. It's not saying we're all agreed. I mean, there are tense moments. We've all been Methodist been going to annual conference forever. We know they happen, but we never finish an annual conference that I'm not extremely grateful for the clergy and laity of the North Texas Annual Conference. So it will be fun. It'll be great.
We'll leave it at that. I'll just say, sometimes you go to your own annual conference and it seems a lot more stressful. When you go visit somebody else's, it's a lot more fun. So I'll look forward to seeing you there, and really appreciate your work in ministry, and thanks for the time today.
Hey, thanks, Scott. Always good to be with y'all. Tell everybody hello. Peace. Bye-bye.
Joining us again today for his weekly watch list is Texas Impact's Advocacy Director, Joshua Houston. Josh, so good to see you again.
Hey, good to see you, Scott.
So we've had a chance to talk offline several times over the course of the last month, as we always do, but especially this last month because there are two elections in the month of May in the great state of Texas. The first one was May 7th and featured constitutional amendment elections, but also a lot of local school board races. So what did you see in those school board races?
Yeah, so it was a really interesting, if you read the headlines, the dominant narrative that's out there is that the culture warriors won big at your local school board level. And yes, they won some races, but the narrative is not always the reality, especially in the media. Again, they won some, about a dozen, but I can also point to a dozen counterexamples. And the problem is that there's no really good centralized list that we've been able to come across of what amounts to thousands of local school board elections. According to the Texas Association of School Boards, 73% of school districts had an election on May 7th. And in case you're curious how many that is in real numbers, there's 1,000 school boards in the state. So that's 750 districts that had an election, and there's usually more than one seat on the ballot. So you can conservatively say there were more than 1,000. And the data sample we're going to be working from is 24. So it is a very limited data sample. Nevertheless, let's look at this limited data sample because the culture warriors are crowing about what amounts to about a dozen races. That's the big thing that they're claiming to be a mandate and a landslide. And the media is reporting what those groups are telling them. Again, let's talk about how school district elections work. They're exceptionally difficult to track. They're also exceptionally difficult to track campaign finance at a school board level. We do know because they made a press release about it, that a mobile phone company has pumped $500,000 into about a dozen races in Tarrant County. And that is, that's really a lot for a school board race. But by comparison, a competitive state house seat, you're competitive at $200,000. So that is a lot of money for a school board race. And we do know that money, and that's not the only money involved, it's hard to track because money is also flowing to the far right kind of culture war groups that are out there too that do the grassroots organizing. There's no way to track that because it's nonprofit money if it's even incorporated like that. So for the most part, school board races are sleepy local elections. It's not all that different from when I was in school in the 1990s and one of my friend's dads ran for the school board. It was a very personal, very who you know, which means it was exposed, if you will, to a blitzkrieg like this, a big third-party group money. And again, limited data sample, but if they're crowing about 12, we can also point to just as many candidates that survived that blitzkrieg by third-party group money. And so that's where it gets interesting if you really dive into why. And so here's a couple takeaways. Money matters, let's be real. But those of you who've heard me talk before, money only prevails when voters aren't paying attention. Period. As one candidate said, we're not trying to change anyone's mind. We're trying to get people to wake up to what's at stake. And that was really a big takeaway. People were not paying attention. And so money was allowed to be quite influential. Let's talk about what the money did. The money mobilized existing infrastructure. So let's talk about what I mean by this. The geography, the locations, the boards where culture warriors won was not all that surprising for anybody who watches this professionally. So in Northeast Tarrant County, there were several school districts in that part of the county. They have had a very active and very organized Tea Party infrastructure since at least 2010, as long as I've had this job, which has been more than 11 years now. Same's true in Lake Travis, where they had pretty good results. But let's look at where kind of the normal or the pro-equity, or at least the non-bigoted candidates won. It's hard to categorize a large group like that, but where there were pre-existing groups of moms, frankly, pre-existing groups that were focused on equity, whether it be an anti-racism group or an LGBT support group. Those little volunteer, never meant to be political things had meeting places for parents to be organized. And so you look at Eames ISD, which is a suburb of Austin, Richardson, a suburb of Dallas, Pflugerville, Alamo Heights, Lake Highlands. They were all able to counter this big money because they had this existing infrastructure of local groups. So geography mattered. This was not an urban or a rural issue. Those communities are more monolithic, and this is not where the battleground is occurring. The battlefield is suburbia. But let's be real clear, not all suburbia is the same. Where your ideological culture warrior candidates won was in very wealthy and very white suburbs. And your more diverse inner ring suburbs, like in Dallas, Richardson compared to Dallas, or Pflugerville compared to Austin, in those areas, equity won at the ballot box. So the takeaway is there are going to be more school board races coming up in November. It's a local option kind of situation where each school board can choose and elect to do their elections in the spring and May, or they can do them in November. There will be more. So advice from the takeaways to avoid kind of a white nationalist takeover of your school board is to find or form your own local group. Invite all your friends to join and do it this week. This organizing work takes a while. Are you a church with an anti-racism task force? It's time to activate it. Time to stop reading books and to get with parents and schools and find out what they need. These groups did not exist to be and are not partisan. They're not wanting to be political. They're just simply wanting to support people of different races, different ethnicities, different sexual orientations in their community. But the existence of these equity groups provides a space for parents to talk and share information about what's going on in their community.
When you talk about culture warriors and we talk about people putting money into these races, is the driving factor still book banning? Is that the organizing principle?
Yeah, there's not a good name. They're banning books. They're anti-critical race theory, which is only a thing taught in higher ed. It doesn't happen in K through 12, but they don't care about facts. They don't like the existence of LGBT folks. They don't want you to say gay in the classroom. They don't want a teacher who might, sometimes teachers keep pictures of their spouses in their classroom, and they don't want a same-sex couple having those same rights.
I will say it's made the summer reading list for my 6-year-old much easier when I have a list of books that maybe he should be reading. So I do appreciate that little bit of help. Moving on to the next round of elections, we do we're in the middle of early voting right now. Election day is May 24th. What are you watching as we move towards that primary runoff?
Yeah, the runoffs are coming up. Early voting is underway as of Monday. And additionally, there's a fun thing for the nerds out there that really watch this in depth. It's called the 8-day reports. That is your campaign finance filing with the Texas Ethics Commission. 8 days before an election date, they have to file their reports. It gives you an idea of the money going on, the money behind the various grassroots groups, of course, that's not reported is also illuminated. You can just presuppose that it's there if they're given to the candidate. And that's the infrastructure that we were talking about earlier. So on the Republican side, it's not any different than it's been for the last decade. And I want to kind of sum it up like this. There's institutional money, and it is generally on one side, and it's squaring off with ideological money, which is usually supporting the other candidate that's in the runoff on the other side. So let's talk about what I mean by institutional money. I'm talking about things like agriculture, hospitals and healthcare interests, telecom, utilities, public education. You start to see it kind of at a more local level too, with business interests like beer distributors or correctional officers or police or local fire. That is your money that represents institutions that we rely on, either for jobs or economically or for fire and police, public safety. Then there's ideological money. So let's talk about what I mean by ideological money. This is usually less than half a dozen in any given race. Got about 6, and that's a high number, independently wealthy billionaires that are able to fund. And often they funnel it through political action committees, or they fund it through dark money C4s or whatever, but all roads tend to lead back to the same, people. And the key word here is independent. They are not accountable to any institution. It's just their own ideology and their own money that they are accountable to no one for, and so they're pushing their own ideological agenda. So that is largely what you see on the Republican side. And here's how it plays out. When institutional money wins, it doesn't really result in an emboldened elected official, but it does tamp down on some of the vitriol. And it's a two-step process. This is just step one of step two. Step two is November. But if you go back to 2018, not that long ago, the last comparable election cycle, actually 4 years ago, you had the institutional money prevail in the runoffs. And then you had a November where the Democratic Party picked up some seats. That combination led to a 2019 session that really did not have bathroom bills. It was really focused on public education.
Right.
The hot button issues weren't really front and center. So this is, a thing to watch. It'll give you a pretty good indication of how next session will go. It's step one of a two-step dance. On the Democratic side, just to wrap things up on the runoffs, it's a little more interesting than it's been in years past. And that corresponds largely to an increase in turnout. So if you look at like the early part of the teens, the Democratic primary was roughly 2% of the voting age population that bothered to participate. It's more than doubled now in the last two cycles in 18 and in 2020. You've had more than double the turnout in participation in Democratic primaries. So that's interesting, and it's just good that people are turning out. I'd like it to be a higher number on both sides, but it is progress. Let's look at a couple of different statewide races and South Texas races. Let's start with South Texas. A lot of eyes are on South Texas for a number of reasons. There are Republicans believe they can pick up some seats in November, and then so that makes it an interesting two-step dance, what we just talked about in reverse. Right. But what's happening in South Texas is you are getting a more ideological primary that's occurring. It tends to be a more conservative Democrat part of the state or more moderate. So you have a place where moderates and more progressive candidates are squaring off. And South Texas is just a very different cultural place than, say, even the urban areas. It's not about race, it's about geography, interestingly enough. And so there's a real question about which way does it go? Do the moderates or the progressives have a better night, or is it mixed? Can you even tell anything from it? And if you can, does that affect November in any way, shape, or form? And people will be looking very closely at that. At a statewide level, it's kind of a more simple question. How much does identity politics prevail? And you can look at the names and races of the candidates on the statewide level, and we'll see.
All right. Well, definitely a lot to watch over the course of the next week. Josh, thanks a lot. We'll be watching with you.
Thanks, Scott.
I want to thank our guests today, Father Paul Klitzke, Bishop Mike McKee, Josh Houston, but I especially want to thank you for tuning in. Y'all, there are a lot of issues in the world right now that require public policy attention, and we'll try to cover as many of them as we can. But at the end of the day, it's going to come back to elections and conversations with our elected representatives and candidates for office. Texas Impact is working to bring you the tools to be an effective advocate, but at the end of the day, it's going to come down to whether or not each of us are willing to put in the time and effort it will take to bring about a more just Texas. I hope this week you'll make a plan to vote. Vote, and then invite 5 friends to join you. And then I hope that we'll all take just one more small step to further engage in the policy process. I hope today's episode gives you something to think about. As always, please feel free to reach out with questions, comments, or suggestions. And I hope you'll share the important content in this episode with your friends and congregations. And with that, it's time to draw this episode to a close. If you've stayed with us this long, you must have enjoyed the content, so I hope you'll share it with your friends and congregations and leave us a rating or review. That way, even more of your friends can find us and join in the movement for justice in Texas. And there's a lot going on, so keep an eye on Texas Impact social media for upcoming announcements, or email me at scott@texasimpact.org with questions. And remember, if you appreciate Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, please make sure that you and your congregation are members of Texas Impact by going to texasimpact.org. Friends, these are wild times, and 2022 is an important year for democracy and our communities. The world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnett, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.